The first thing Bran understood was the silence. Not silence the way silence exists in rooms or in sleep or in the moments between words, but silence the way it exists in space, which is to say, total, structural, a silence built into the nature of the universe and unbroken by anything because there was nothing left to break it. He floated in it for what might have been seconds or might have been much longer, held loosely in the crash harness, his helmet still sealed, the emergency light above him throwing everything into the particular orange-red of catastrophe, and he listened to the silence and let it tell him what it knew. It knew a great deal. It knew the battle was over. It knew the main drives were gone, because there was no vibration in the deck plating, and gun batteries lived or died by the vibration of the drives that fed them. You could feel a ship's health in your teeth if you'd worked aboard one long enough, and Bran had worked aboard one for 7 years, and what he felt in his teeth now was nothing. It knew the battery had separated from the vantage, because the connection corridor was gone. He could see where it had sheared, the metal twisted into a jagged rosette of torn steel that someone had tried to seal, after the fact, with emergency foam. It knew that the foam had held, because he was breathing. He did an inventory before he moved. This was not training, this was the thing that had kept him alive through 3 deployments, 2 of which had involved actual combat, which put him above the average for weapons technicians, who were not supposed to see combat directly, being several layers of hull removed from the actual killing. The inventory went hands, feet, torso, neck. He pressed each group of muscles with deliberate care. Everything responded. He ran his hands over the helmet seals, the suit seals at wrist and ankle and collar. Everything held. Suit read 91% oxygen, which was good, which was better than good, which was the first thing that had gone right in however many hours it had been. He looked at his wrist display. 3 hours and 14 minutes since the emergency systems had kicked on, which was approximately when the battery had separated, which was approximately when the Keth plasma volley had taken out the Vantage's midship section and turned 600 people into light. He had not witnessed this directly. He had witnessed it on his targeting display, which had gone white and then dead, and then the battery had been thrown sideways, and after that he had not witnessed anything until now. He unclipped the harness. He found Medic Yarel first, because she was making noise. Not words, exactly, but the specific controlled exhale of someone who is managing significant pain with every available tool in their possession and finding those tools barely adequate. She was still in her harness, one arm held carefully against her body. Her helmet cracked along the left side in a way that should have killed her and hadn't only because the inner seal had held. The crack was sealed now with suit adhesive. She had done this herself, while Bran was unconscious, with a broken arm, which told him something about Yael that he had not fully known before. "Report," he said, because there was nothing else to say, because the word report was the word that meant I'm here, you're not alone, tell me what I need to know. "Radius fracture, left forearm," she said, with the flat precision of someone reading from a medical chart about a stranger. "No pneumothorax. Probable concussion, mild. Oren is the problem." Oren was the engineer. Bran found him on the deck, which meant his harness had failed or he hadn't been wearing it properly, which was an argument Bran had lost with Oren 3 separate times in the past year. He was breathing. That was the first thing. The second thing was the blood, which had pooled under him in the microgravity and then spread slowly outward in a flat dark halo, already cooling at the edges, and the source of which was a head wound that ran from his right temple back toward the crown of his skull. Head wounds bled extravagantly. That was the thing about head wounds, they made themselves look worse than they were, sometimes, and they made themselves look better than they were, sometimes, and the only way to know which was to have a medic look at them, and the medic they had was the one currently holding her broken arm against her body and breathing through her nose with such controlled precision that each exhale sounded like a small act of will. "Talk me through it," Bran said. "I've slowed the bleeding." He regained consciousness briefly. He knew his name, he knew where he was, he didn't know the date, which is acceptable. "The concern is intracranial pressure. I can't scan him with what we have. I can watch him, I can keep him still, I can look for the signs, and I can do nothing useful if the signs appear." She paused. "I'm telling you that clearly so you understand the situation." Understood. He needs a surgery suite within 6 hours. Call it 4 to have a buffer. Bran looked at the torn metal rosette where the connection corridor had been, at the emergency foam seal, at the orange-red light that meant emergency power only, at the wrist display reading 3 hours and 14 minutes. He said nothing about the 6 hours. He turned to do the inventory of the battery itself. The battery was, structurally, a box. It was a reinforced box designed to absorb the recoil of 4 Type 9 mass drivers and the heat of continuous plasma cycling, which meant the walls were thick and the internal framework was overbuilt, and the whole thing had apparently survived separation from a ship that had not survived as something close to intact. Emergency power was live. The battery had its own cells, rated for 36 hours of minimal operation, and minimal operation currently meant lights, life support, the suit comms, and one of the targeting screens, which showed nothing because it was pulling from the Vantage's sensor grid and the Vantage was no longer in a condition to provide one. The mass drivers themselves were cold and useless, not because they were damaged, but because they had nothing to draw power from and nowhere to aim at anything and no ship to receive firing solutions from. They stood in their housings like monuments. Bran put his hand on one, briefly, not for any tactical reason, but because it was the thing he knew best in the room, and he needed something he knew. Sayo was at the communications console. She had been at the communications console the entire time, he suspected. She was buckled into the secondary comm seat, her dark hair loose from its tie, one side of her face marked with a bruise that had developed while he was unconscious, and her hands were moving with careful, deliberate slowness over the console's manual interface, the haptic keys, the frequency sliders. Her eyes were closed. This was notable. People did not close their eyes while operating comm consoles, not as a general rule, because the visual readouts were necessary for navigation of frequency space. But Sayo's eyes were closed, and her face had the particular expression, something between concentration and pain, but not quite either, that Bran had learned, over 2 years of working beside her, meant she was listening to something the equipment alone couldn't capture. "Sayo," he said. She held up one finger. The gesture was so ordinary, so much the gesture of someone asking for a moment, that it almost made him laugh, and the laugh died in his chest without ever reaching his face. He waited. After 45 seconds, he counted, she opened her eyes. They were her mother's eyes, dark brown, full human. The rest of her face carried the angles and the faint bioluminescent undertone of Keth biology, visible now in the emergency lighting as a very slight, very steady pulse along her cheekbones, which only ever happened when her nervous system was under significant load. He had seen it twice before, once during the approach to the Keshri engagement, and once when they had received word that the Meridian had been lost with all hands, including her brother. "We have power," she said. "Comms are live on emergency band. I've been sending the beacon for approximately 2 hours. Have you received anything?" "From our side, no." She held his gaze with absolute steadiness. "From the Keth side, yes." The silence extended. "Tell me," he said. "Later." She glanced toward Oren, toward Yael, and back. "Let me tell you when you've finished your assessment." He understood. He nodded and turned back to the box they were living in, the box that was drifting, the box that had no drives and no weapons and no connection to anything except the thin thread of an emergency beacon screaming into 200 kilometers of debris, and he finished his assessment, and then he went to hear what Sayo had to tell him. She showed him on the screen, though the screen was inadequate for what she was describing, which was the nature of screens when the thing being described was sound. "Keth communication uses 4 channels simultaneously," she said, her voice low and technically precise, the voice she used when she was keeping herself at a distance from the information she was conveying. 2 are electromagnetic, those are the ones our equipment reads. 2 are biological, sub-auditory resonance patterns generated by the Keth vocal structure. I hear both sets. This is how interpretation works. The EM channels carry the literal content, and the biological channels carry what you'd call context. Emotional register. Urgency. She paused. "You understand I'm simplifying." "I understand." "In the engagement, I was using this to provide targeting data. When a Keth ship's crew went into high-alert biological resonance, it typically preceded a weapons charge by about 12 seconds. I was reporting that to gunnery control and they were using it for pre-fire solutions." She looked at her hands on the console. "I've been doing that for 3 years on this ship." That's not what I need you to understand right now." "What do you need me to understand?" "I need you to understand that the same ability that made me useful for targeting is now picking up distress signals. Keth distress signals. They're different from their combat signals. I need you to understand this, Bran, because it matters for what I'm going to tell you. They're completely different. The biological resonance in distress is lower frequency and rhythmic. It functions similarly to a heartbeat. It's an involuntary response. They can't turn it off. And some of the Keth ships in this debris field have survivors, and those survivors are generating that resonance, and I can hear all of them. Bran was very still. How many? He said. I've isolated 11 distinct signals. Some of them have been weakening since I started monitoring, and 3 have stopped entirely in the last hour. She touched the screen, which showed a visual frequency map that meant nothing to him and everything to her. The ones that are weakening, I think they're dying. The ones that stopped, I think they're gone. You've been listening to this for 2 hours. Yes. He looked at her face. The bioluminescent pulse along her cheekbones had not slowed. He thought about what it would be like to have a sense that could not be turned off, that was picking up the dying sounds of a species you were half descended from, in a debris field that was a graveyard of ships those people had crewed, while sitting in a metal box and waiting to find out if anyone was coming to save you. He did not say this. He said, "What's the tactical situation?" 3 of the signals are moving. She said it the same way Yael had described Oren's injury, flatly, factually, with a particular precision of someone who has understood the information fully and is giving it to you exactly as it is. The debris field impedes direct movement. The Keth ships that still have maneuvering capability are navigating through the wreckage. But they're moving in a direction that's consistent with having picked up our beacon. They're homing on our beacon. I think they're homing on me, she said. Keth biology has specific resonance signatures. I have half of one. It's faint, but I think in this much silence, with this much of their signal-reading equipment still functional, it might be readable. Yes. Yael, from across the battery, said, "Can you stop transmitting it?" No. As I said, it's involuntary. It's like asking someone to stop their heartbeat. Can we mask it? Sayo turned to the console. There are EM emissions we can generate that might partially disrupt the biological read. The standard EW suite would do it. We don't have the standard EW suite, we have a targeting battery, but I can attempt to use the comm systems to create interference. She was already moving as she said it, her hands finding the controls with the confidence of someone who has worked comm systems long enough to know them without looking. It won't be total, but it might reduce the range at which they can read the signal. Do it, Bran said. I'm doing it. He walked to the center of the battery and stood between the cold mass drivers and thought about the shape of the problem. They had a beacon transmitting on emergency band, which would attract rescue but would also attract Keth survivors who might read it as something else. They had a crew member whose biological signature was a navigational signal in the wrong direction. They had an engineer who needed a surgery suite in what was now approximately 3.5 hours. They had no drives, no weapons, emergency power rated for another 33 hours, and walls thick enough to survive separation from an exploding ship. They had limited options in each category. He went to check on Oren. Oren was awake, which was good. Oren was awake and trying to sit up, which was not good, and Yael was preventing this with her uninjured arm and a stream of low, direct speech that was doing the job without kindness because kindness was not the tool Yael reached for when directness was available. Oren subsided. He looked up at Bran with the slightly unfocused gaze of a man whose head was full of something that shouldn't be there. How bad, he said. The words were clear. That was something. Head wound, Bran said. You need to stay still. I'm going to assess it and tell you the truth, Yael said. And the truth is that I don't know, and I'm watching you, and you need to tell me immediately if anything changes in how you feel. She turned to Bran. He's oriented to person and place. Speech is clear. I'm watching his pupils. Okay. Bran crouched beside Oren. Can you work? What do you need? Not yet. But I need to know if you can. Oren thought about it with the careful deliberation of someone taking inventory of themselves, which Bran recognized because he had done the same thing 20 minutes ago. Yes, he said. Slow. But yes. Good. Rest. He went back to Sayo. She was working the console with both hands now, the interference pattern building across the display, and the pulse at her cheekbones had not slowed, and she was making very small movements with her jaw, not quite chewing, not quite grinding, but something between them that he had never seen her make before. He sat beside her without asking permission, which was the right approach with Sayo, who would have refused it if he'd asked. Tell me what you hear, he said. From them. Not tactically. what you actually hear. She didn't stop working. Her hands didn't pause. But something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though she had decided something, and then she said, "It sounds like calling." The distress resonance. Keth biology does this particular thing when it's trying to locate others of its kind. It's a reaching sound. She stopped. Started again. In the data files, it's classified as a threat-locating behavior. And it is that. But when you hear it in the context of a debris field, among ships that have just been destroyed, from the survivors of those ships, it doesn't sound like threat-locating. It sounds like what it sounds like when any living thing has been cut off from everything it knows and is trying to find out if anything is left. He looked at the display. "There are 3 signals moving toward us," he said. "Yes. How long?" "At current rate of movement through the debris, 2 hours. Maybe less. The debris field is irregular. There are passages where movement is easier, and if they find those passages, it could be faster. And the interference you're building. It's built. It's running." She finally glanced at him. "I don't know if it will work. I've never done this before. I've never had reason to." Bran sat with that for a moment. Then, "Whatever happens, you understand that I know you spent this whole battle doing your job." Her expression did not change, but the pulse at her cheekbones slowed, very slightly, just once, and then resumed. "I know," she said. I'm all right, Bran." He didn't press it. He got up and began to think about the walls. The walls of the battery were thick, but they were not airtight by design beyond the emergency foam seal. There were access points, maintenance hatches, the docking collar on the rear face of the battery where resupply connections had been made during operation. The collar was unpowered. The hatches were sealed by physical locks. He went to each one and checked each lock and counted each seal and thought, with the measured, operational part of his mind that had kept him alive through 3 deployments, "This is a box, and there are things outside the box, and there are points where the outside can become the inside, and I need to know every one of them." He knew every one of them by the time the first hour had passed. He did not tell the others what he was doing. Yael was watching Oren. Sio was monitoring. There was nothing they could do about the access points that he was not already doing, and so there was nothing to gain from telling them, except the specific weight of knowing, which he was carrying already and saw no reason to distribute. Outside the walls, in the silence that was total and structural and built into the nature of the universe, the debris field moved with the slow dignity of catastrophe. 41 ships reduced to components, spread across 200 kilometers, tumbling in the orbits they'd been thrown into by the force of their own destruction. 30,000 people who had been alive 6 hours ago. He had known some of them, the way you know people on ships, by face, by role, by the particular habits of the shared spaces that ship life created. He did not allow himself to think about them in any particular way. He would think about them later, at a time he was not responsible for 3 living people in a box. He filed them, carefully, in the part of himself designated for later, and he went back to the center of the battery and stood between the cold mass drivers, and he waited. The waiting was its own kind of discipline. At the 90-minute mark, one of the 3 moving signals stopped. Sio reported it without drama. "One signal has gone static. 68 degrees starboard relative, estimated 1.3 kilometers." A pause. "I think their maneuverability failed. They're drifting. Can they restart?" "I can't tell that. The biological signal doesn't give me engineering data." Too moving. The battery had drifted since the separation. Small movements, the result of the infinitesimal gravitational influences of the surrounding debris, nothing controlled, nothing directed. Bran was tracking it as well as he could on the one functioning targeting screen, which was giving him relative motion data even without the ship sensor grid, because the mass drivers had passive ranging capability built in, and he had been a weapons technician for 7 years and knew which systems to ask questions of. The drift was not helpful. It was moving them toward the denser portion of the debris field, where the large hull sections of the Vantage and the Covenant and the Perseverance tumbled slowly together, a geography of wreckage that would complicate any approach from outside. Rescue would need to navigate it. Everything would need to navigate it. Oren woke from a half-sleep and said, clearly, "The drift is wrong." Bran turned. Yael had her hand on Oren's wrist, checking something, and she looked up sharply. "Stay still," she said. "I'm not moving." He wasn't. His eyes were tracking the ceiling, which was what engineers did when they were calculating. They looked at something fixed and used it as a reference. We're rotating. Very slowly. Clockwise from the dorsal axis. I can feel it. Can you correct it? Bran asked. From here. Not without power to the attitude thrusters, which we don't have. But the rotation is going to become a problem if we need to dock with anything. He paused. When rescue comes, they'll need a stable docking face. How long do we have before the rotation is significant? Already significant. Noticeable in 3 hours, maybe. From a docking perspective. Bran looked at Yael. Her face said, 3 hours is also my window. She didn't say it out loud. He filed it. What can we do from inside? Mass redistribution. Move weight to one side, change the moment of inertia, alter the rotation rate. Not stop it. We don't have enough mass with precise enough control. But slow it. Oren looked at him. I can calculate it. I can tell you where to move what. You need to stay still. I can stay still and calculate. Give me the scope of what we can move. Bran gave him the list. Oren closed his eyes, which should have been terrifying, but which Bran recognized as the same thing Sio did with her eyes, the external world going dark so the internal one could run at full capacity. He left the engineer to it and went back to Sio. 2 signals, he said. 2 signals. She had not moved from the console in 90 minutes. She had accepted water when he'd brought it, pressing the tube against the inside of her helmet with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to drink in a suit without thinking about it. Otherwise she had been still, her hands moving with small precise adjustments, her face carrying that expression that was not quite concentration and not quite pain. The closer one is approximately 40 minutes out at current rate. Debris field is thinning in their approach corridor. I think they found a passage. Could be 30. You're sure they're coming for us? Their trajectory is consistent, and I'm the only human Keth signal in this debris field. She paused. I've considered the possibility that I'm wrong. I keep running the same analysis. I keep arriving at the same conclusion. If they reach us, Bran said. Yes. They'll try to enter. Probably. Injured. Low on power. We're a solid structure. We're life support. She looked at him. They're not coming here to fight us. I want you to understand that. The biological resonance I'm reading from these signals, it's not combat aroused. It's distress. Pure distress. They're hurt, and they're alone, and they're navigating through the wreckage of their fleet, and they're following the closest signal of living things. Which is you? Which is me? He turned and looked at the maintenance hatches. He looked at the docking collar. He looked at the mass drivers, cold and useless and very large, taking up most of the floor space. He looked at Yael, who had heard all of this, whose face was giving him nothing he didn't already know. He looked at Oren, who was running calculations behind his closed eyes with a head wound, and who needed a surgery suite that was not here. He had a sidearm. Standard issue, carried in a magnetic clip on the suit's hip plate. He had not thought about it until now, which told him something about how he'd been thinking about the situation, and he thought about it now with a measured operational clarity that had kept him alive through 3 deployments, and he came to no conclusions, and he thought about it some more, and he came to the same no conclusions, and he stopped thinking about it and stood between the cold mass drivers and waited. Yael came to stand beside him. She was holding her broken arm carefully. The arm Bran had immobilized against her body with whatever he could find that would serve, a length of comm cable, a folded equipment pad, and her face was the face of a medic who has done her calculations and found the outputs unacceptable and is now doing the thing that medics do when the outputs are unacceptable, which is continue anyway. When they reach us, she said very quietly, so Oren wouldn't hear, though Oren's eyes were still closed. I don't know, Bran said. Neither do I. She looked at the nearest maintenance hatch. There are 4 of us and 1 of me, and only one of us needs surgery. I know. I'm not saying anything about what we should do. I'm saying that I need you to know that I know what the calculus looks like, and I'm not going to be unhelpful about it. He looked at her. Unhelpful. There are medics who would object. On principle. To options that would. She stopped. Started again with different words. I'm telling you that I won't be a problem. He thought about this for a long moment. "I haven't decided anything," he said. "I know. I'm telling you what my constraints are so you can plan." "All right. All right." She went back to Oren. Bran stood where he was. "From the comm console," Sayo said, without turning, 20 minutes. The second signal was still moving. At the 15-minute mark, Sayo said, "They've stopped. The second signal has stopped moving." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "The third signal has not." One. How far? "Current rate, 10 minutes. Maybe 8. Her hands were very still on the console now. "He's not navigating the debris field anymore, Bran. He's moving through it. Direct line. He. The signal is male. Keth biology broadcasts sex as part of the resonance signature. It's a fundamental frequency component. I can't not know it." She paused again. "He's young. Young biological signals have it's a rate thing, a tempo to the resonance that changes with age. He's young." Bran went to the docking collar. He ran his hands over the manual release, the collar housing, the seal indicators. The collar was designed for controlled connection. It required external cooperation to open from outside. It was not designed to be impregnable. Nothing on a ship was designed to be impregnable, because ships were working environments, and the first principle of working environments was that you had to be able to get in and out of everything. He had known this when he'd catalogued the access points, and he knew it now, and he stood at the collar and put his hands on it and thought about what he was going to do. "From across the battery," Oren said, without opening his eyes, "move the number 3 driver housing 2 meters toward the port wall. It's on a friction lock. You can push it without tools. It'll slow the rotation by about 40%. Nobody moved. "I heard the conversation," Oren said, still without opening his eyes. "I've been awake. Move the driver housing and then tell me what we're doing about the Keth." Bran moved the driver housing. It took 4 minutes and significant effort, and when it was done he was breathing hard and the rotation of the battery was, according to the passive ranging display, visibly slower. Then he turned to face the battery. All of it, all of them, Yael with her broken arm, Oren with his closed eyes, Sayo at the console with the pulse at her cheekbones running steady and fast. "He's 2 minutes out," Sayo said. "I know," Bran said. "He's injured. The signal is, he's in significant distress. This isn't a combat approach. He found a pressurized structure with biological signatures, and he's approaching it because it's the only thing in 200 kilometers that looks like survival." "I know," Bran said. 1 minute. "He's at the collar," Sayo said. The sound came through the hull that was thick, that was built to absorb the recoil of Type 9 mass drivers, that had survived the destruction of the ship it had been part of. The sound came through it anyway, a metal-on-metal contact, very faint, the sound of something touching the docking collar from outside. Then a pause. Then a more deliberate contact, hands, Bran thought, or whatever the Keth equivalent was, hands finding the collar, understanding the collar, beginning to work the collar. Bran put his hand on the sidearm. He felt Yael looking at him from across the battery. He felt Oren listening, somewhere behind his closed eyes. He felt Sayo's stillness at the console, which was not the stillness of waiting but the stillness of someone who has already absorbed what is going to happen and is simply present for it. Outside, the collar moved. The collar moved because the Keth who was working it knew how it worked. Keth and human design had enough in common, after 60 years of contact and 40 years of conflict, that docking collars were essentially the same, and the Keth who was working it was, apparently, not too injured to work it, but the sounds that came through the hull as he did were not the sounds of easy competence. They were slow. They were irregular. There were pauses that lasted too long, and in those pauses the sounds were different, lower, a vibration that was almost inaudible but that Sayo's face told Bran she could hear clearly, a distress resonance pressed up against the hull of the battery from outside. The color indicator light changed from gray to amber. Contact established. External operator requesting entry. Bran took his hand off the sidearm. He looked at the indicator. He looked at his people. He looked at Sayo, whose face was turned toward the collar now, whose expression had resolved into something he could not name. Not hope and not fear and not the version of combat readiness that he recognized from 3 years of knowing her. Something else. Something that had no operational designation. He went to the collar and he opened it from the inside. He came through the collar the way injured things come through openings, slowly, taking weight where he could, letting go of things carefully rather than dropping. He was larger than Bran had expected. The Keth were not, as a species, dramatically larger than humans, but this one was tall, broad through the shoulders, and his suit was a dark gunmetal color that was almost black, marked with the insignia of what Bran's targeting experience recognized as a Keth third ship position, not command, not engineering, something in the middle. And the suit had a long burn mark across the back of the left leg that had compromised the insulation but not the seal, and there was a crack in the helmet. That had been sealed, hastily, with something that was not suit adhesive and might have been sealant foam from a repair kit, and the seal was holding but only barely. He got through the collar and Bran closed it behind him. They looked at each other. The Keth's face was visible through the helmet, the same bioluminescent undertone that Sio carried, but full spectrum, running from cheekbone to jaw to brow ridge, currently very dim, not the dim of rest, but the dim of depletion, of a body running low on everything. His eyes were dark, with the slightly wider iris of Keth biology, and they were tracking the room with the same careful deliberateness Bran had used when he'd first woken up. Assessment. Inventory. The same process in a different species. He was young. Bran could see it, now that he could see him, not youth in the human sense exactly, but something in the face that corresponded to it, a quality that was less worn than it should have been, given what the last 6 hours had contained. He raised one hand. Open palm. The Keth equivalent of the gesture, Bran happened to know from the contact protocols he'd had to study, was 2 fingers pressed flat, but the open palm, apparently, read across the species line clearly enough, because the Keth's posture shifted, fractionally, in a way that said, received. From behind Bran, Sio spoke. She spoke in Keth, or in something that was approximately Keth. The spoken language supplemented, Bran could now see, by the faint resonance he could feel in the floor plating if he was paying attention, a vibration so low it was barely there, and the Keth turned toward her immediately, his whole body orienting to the sound the way a compass orients to north. He responded. His voice was low, even through the helmet, and Bran understood none of it, but Sio's face as she listened was doing something complicated. "His ship is gone," she said, in standard, still looking at him. 14 crew. He got clear in an emergency suit when the reactor went critical. He's been navigating the debris field for 2 hours. A pause. He found our signal, mine, and he followed it because it was the only thing that felt like, I'm translating loosely, the only thing that felt like something that might understand him. Something that might understand him. Bran looked at Sio. She was looking at the Keth. "Tell him this is a pressurized space," Bran said. "Tell him he can remove his helmet if he needs to. Tell him we won't." He stopped. "Tell him we won't hurt him." She spoke again. The Keth listened. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom each motion costs something, he raised his hands and broke the helmet seal and took it off. The burn on his left leg was worse than the suit had shown. Even from across the battery, Bran could see the tissue damage where the heat had come through. The leg was operational, barely, which explained the slowness and the pauses at the collar. Yarel was looking at it with the expression of a medic doing triage calculations she has not been asked to do, and who is not going to volunteer the results unless asked. The Keth looked at Oren. He looked at Yael's arm. He looked at Bran. He looked, for a long time, at Sio. He spoke. "He says he knows what I am," Sio said. Her voice was entirely level. "He says he's sorry for—" She stopped. Her hands were still on the console. "He says he's sorry for what I've been listening to. He knows how Keth distress signals work. He knows that anyone with Keth biology who was in range of this debris field would have been hearing it all." Nobody spoke. The Keth moved, slowly, checking the movement against the injured leg, testing how much it would cooperate, and made his way to the far corner of the battery, the corner that was farthest from Oren, farthest from the mass drivers, farthest from the collar. He folded himself into it with the specific economy of someone who is trying to take up as little space as possible, who is trying to communicate, through posture alone, that they understand the terms of their situation and are not going to violate them. He put his back in the corner and he did not move again. Yael went to him. Bran did not stop her, because stopping Yael from doing medicine was like stopping water from finding the lowest point, theoretically possible with enough force, never worth the energy. She knelt beside him and looked at the leg and looked at his face and spoke in standard, slowly, And he watched her with those wide dark eyes and said nothing, and Sayo, from the console, translated, "He understands what you're assessing. He understands it's bad. He says he's been through worse." A pause. "He hasn't, but he's trying to be less of a problem." Yael made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She opened her medical kit with her one functional arm, the broken arm pressed against her body, and she began to work. Bran sat in the center of the battery, between the cold mass drivers and the corner, and he thought about what was happening and could not entirely name it. There was a Keth soldier in the corner of his battery. This soldier had spent the last few hours navigating wreckage that he had, in some part, contributed to, because the Keth had brought 43 ships into this engagement and they had not all survived either, whatever the final outcome had been. And Bran had contributed to that, because he was a weapons technician and the battery he was sitting in had been operational for 4 hours of that engagement, and he had been operational within it, and the targeting solutions that Sayo had provided and that he had executed had been accurate, because that was what accurate targeting meant. This thought was not new. It was, in fact, the thought that underlaid every engagement, the thought that the training tried to route around and that the debrief language was specifically structured to avoid, the thought that lived in the space between weapons effect confirmed and what weapons effect confirmation actually meant for the people on the other end of it. He looked at the corner. The Keth was sitting with his eyes closed. Yael had done what she could with the leg, which was not enough, Bran could tell from the set of her shoulders, which was the closest Yael ever came to expressing frustration, and had returned to Oren. The battery hummed with emergency power. The emergency light threw everything in orange-red. Sayo had turned in her chair to face the corner. She was watching him with an expression that Bran had no name for and did not try to name. "Is he in pain?" Bran asked. "Yes." "Are they coming back?" He meant the Keth fleet. He did not need to specify. "The signals in the debris field are all stationary now," she said. "No movement. The two that were moving stopped. I think they ran out of maneuverability. Or, she didn't finish the alternative. I'm not picking up anything on EM or biological outside the debris field. But I can only hear so far." "If they come back," Bran said, "then we have a Keth soldier in our battery when they arrive, and that is a different kind of problem." "Yes. I'm not going to tell you what to do about that." "I'm not asking you to," Oren said from the floor. "I am. Tell me what to do about that, so I have something to think about other than my head." He paused. "It hurts less when I think about complex problems." "Then think about docking stability," Bran said. "Think about what rescue is going to need when it arrives." "I've already thought about it. Give me a harder problem." Nobody gave him a harder problem. They sat with the easier one, which was not easy, and the battery drifted, and the emergency light held steady. At some point, Bran was not certain when, because time had become strange, and he was not managing it as precisely as he had been in the early hours, the Keth in the corner spoke. Very quietly, without opening his eyes. Sayo translated, "He says his name." The battery was quiet. "Why?" Bran asked. "Because he wants someone to know it. In case." She paused. "Because knowing someone's name means they were real. He says this is a Keth, I'm translating loosely again, a Keth idea of what happens after. That your name continues in the minds of those who knew you." She stopped. "He says it in Keth, but the concept is—" She stopped again. Her jaw was doing the thing it had done before, the thing between clenching and grinding. "The concept is very close to something I grew up with." Bran did not ask for the name. He did not know, in that moment, whether he wanted to know the name, whether knowing would make what he was feeling more manageable or less. He suspected less. He suspected that less manageable was, in fact, the correct response to the situation, and that he had been managing too efficiently for too long, and that the name would be the point at which the management failed, and he could not afford that yet. He looked at Sayo. She knew the name. She had heard it in his signal before he'd spoken it. Her face told him this without her saying anything. She had known it since he'd come through the collar, possibly since he'd been 40 minutes out, approaching through the debris field, young and injured and following the only signal that felt like something that might understand him. The Keth soldier's breathing changed. Yael heard it first. She was a medic, she was calibrated for exactly this, and she looked up from Oren, and she looked at the corner, and she set down what she was doing and went to the corner and knelt again. She did not bring her kit. She did not reach for anything that would treat anything. She simply knelt and was present, which was the last tool available when all the other tools had run out. Bran stayed where he was. He thought, this is something I will carry for the rest of my life, whatever the rest of my life turns out to be. He thought it clearly and completely and without evasion, and then he put it in the place where he had put the 30,000 names he was going to carry later, and he watched the corner. The Keth's breathing changed again. Then it stopped. It stopped the way things stopped in the battery. Quietly, without drama, without announcement, the orange-red light holding steady and the emergency power humming and the debris field outside turning slowly in the orbits of catastrophe. Yael sat back on her heels. She was still holding her broken arm against her body. She looked at the corner for a moment, and then she closed her eyes, very briefly, and then she went back to Oren. The rescue ship's designation was the Ardent, a light frigate with medical capability, and it came through the debris field on careful maneuvering thrusters at a speed that suggested its pilot was experienced and frightened in equal measure, because the debris field was exactly as bad as the passive ranging had been suggesting, and possibly worse. Bran had been tracking it on the screen for 11 minutes before it made contact. He had heard its beacon first, the standard band rescue ping that cut through the debris field's EM scatter in a way that only purpose-built rescue equipment could, and those 11 minutes were the longest he had been able to measure since the emergency systems had kicked on 6 hours and 48 minutes ago. Oren was stable. The timeline had been 4 hours, and they were past it, and Oren was stable. His pupils were equal, his speech was clear, his head wound was still bleeding slowly but not alarmingly, and Yael had sat beside him for the last 3 hours with the kind of sustained, focused attention that was essentially a medical procedure in itself, catching him each time he started to drift and pulling him back, keeping him talking about the docking stability calculations, keeping him in the world by making the world require his presence. The Ardent made contact at the docking collar. The collar indicators shifted from gray to amber to green, and the hatch opened, and 3 people came through in rescue suits with the practiced efficiency of people who do this job and are grateful to be doing it, even in a debris field at the end of a catastrophic defeat, because living survivors are the best possible version of what they might have found. The first one through said, "How many?" The most important question. The one that calibrated everything. 4 survivors, Bran said. He said it clearly and without hesitation, and it was true. There were 4 survivors of the battery crew of Gun Battery 7, THNS Vantage, Battle of Solace. Weapons Technician Bran, full function. Medical Specialist Yael, radius fracture and probable concussion, ambulatory. Engineering Specialist 3rd Class Oren, head wound, requiring immediate surgical evaluation. Communications Officer Sayo, no physical injuries. 4 survivors. He said this. It was true. The rescue team worked with speed and competence. Oren was on a stretcher and through the collar within 4 minutes. Yael went next, walking but guided, her broken arm finally relinquished to proper splinting from the rescue team's kit. Sayo went third, and as she passed Bran she stopped and looked at him with her dark brown eyes and the fading bioluminescent pulse at her cheekbones. Fading now because the crisis was resolving, because the nervous system load was lifting, and she held his gaze for a moment that said several things without saying any of them, and then she went through the collar. The rescue team lead said, "Technician, is there anything we need to recover from this space before we undock? Equipment, documentation, classified material." Bran looked at the battery. He looked at the cold mass drivers. He looked at the emergency foam-sealed rosette where the connection corridor had been. He looked at the corner, which was now just a corner, which was ordinary metal in ordinary orange-red light. "Nothing to recover," he said. They undocked from the battery at 19 minutes after contact. The Ardent reversed its maneuvering thrusters and pulled back through the debris field the way it had come, carefully, slowly, and Bran watched through the small observation port as the battery receded, a metal box, tumbling very slowly in the correction that Oren's calculations had achieved, smaller as they moved away from it, then lost among the debris, then gone. Part of the field now. Part of the 200 kilometers. Part of what remained. The Ardent's medical bay was warm in a way that the battery had not been, not dramatically different. Emergency life support maintained temperature within acceptable ranges, but there was something in the warmth that was about more than temperature, about what warmth meant in the presence of people who had come to find you. Oren was already in the surgical suite. Yael was being properly splinted and refusing to hold still for her own concussion assessment until the medic attending her gave up on gentle requests and resorted to the specific tone of professional authority that Yael, apparently, responded to in others the way she deployed it herself. Brand sat in the corridor outside the surgical suite because it was the only place he could sit without being asked to do anything for a few minutes, and he sat there and let the last 7 hours arrange themselves in his mind with the deliberate clarity of a person who is not ready to feel them yet but is willing to see them. A hand came to rest beside his on the bench. Not touching. Beside. He looked up. Sayo sat down next to him, not quite close, with a careful measurement of distance she generally deployed in spaces smaller than a bridge. She was looking at the bulkhead across the corridor. Her cheekbones were still, the pulse gone, her face carrying the quality of deep stillness that was either rest or something that looked like rest from the outside. "The Ardent will file a full action report on our rescue," Brand said. "Command will debrief us individually." "I know. I'll report 4 survivors. The crew of the battery." She said nothing. "The Keth will be accounted for in the larger casualty analysis. There were Keth ships lost. Keth dead. It will be part of the overall engagement accounting." "Yes," she said. "It will." He did not explain further. She had not asked for an explanation. What she had was, simply, the information about what was going to happen, delivered clearly, and she received it with the same clarity with which it had been given. The corridor was quiet except for the hum of the Ardent's drives, different from the battery's emergency hum, lower and more complex, the hum of a functioning ship with functioning systems doing the work that functioning ships did. It was the best sound Brand had heard in 7 hours, possibly longer, and he let himself listen to it for a moment with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief but was located somewhere in that country. "Will you tell me?" he said. She turned her head toward him. "A question." "His name," Brand said. "Not for the report. Not for, I won't do anything with it. I just—" He stopped. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he didn't have the words for what he was asking or why. He had the words for a great many things. He had been working in spaces where words needed to be precise and operational for 7 years, and precision and operational clarity were tools he had developed to a high degree of competence. But this was not a precision operation. This was something else. "No," Sayo said quietly. "Not yet." He looked at her. "Maybe later," she said. "Maybe, I don't know. Some names need to stay somewhere, for a while, before they can go anywhere else." She looked back at the bulkhead. He said his name so someone would know it. Someone knows it. They sat in the corridor outside the surgical suite, and the Ardent moved through what remained of the debris field toward the nearest Allied station, the field thinning as they moved, 41 ships becoming components, becoming smaller pieces, becoming, eventually, just space again, the kind of space that didn't know yet what it was holding, and maybe wouldn't, and maybe that was all right, and maybe it wasn't, and there was no clean resolution to that question, only the ongoing fact of it. Sayo looked at her hands. She turned them over once, palm up, and looked at them, and turned them back. She was thinking about the corner. Brand knew this the way you know things about people you've worked beside for 2 years in small spaces. Not because they tell you, but because you've watched them often enough to understand the grammar of their silences. She was thinking about the corner, and the orange-red light, and the battery drifting in the debris field that had been a fleet 6 hours ago. She was thinking about what 2 fingers pressed flat meant, and what an open palm meant, and the space between them where something had, briefly and improbably, been understood. She was thinking about what it meant to hear a name in a signal before the person who owned it could speak it. To know someone is coming before they arrive. To carry a thing in your hearing that begins in their body, involuntary, unsuppressible, the sound a living thing makes when it has been cut from everything it knew and is trying to find out if anything remains. She was thinking about 11 signals, and 3 signals moving, and then 2, and then 1, and then 1 young Keth soldier navigating 200 kilometers of catastrophe toward the only signal in range that felt like something that might understand him. She had understood him. She had translated for him, and she had listened to what he said about his name, and she had been present when the medic with the broken arm knelt in the corner and did the last thing medicine can do, which is bear witness. She had heard the breathing change. She had heard it stop. She had kept the name. Not to report. Not to do anything with. Not for any purpose that would show up in any debrief or after-action analysis or casualty accounting or engagement summary. She kept it the way the dead are kept when keeping is all that's left, in the living, in the carrying, in the continued fact of knowing it. Some names needed to stay somewhere before they could go anywhere else. She had said this, and it was true, and she had not added the rest of it, which was, and some names stay forever, and that's also true, and I am the right person for this one, because I heard it before he even spoke it, and that means something I do not have a word for in any language I know. The ardent cleared the debris field. Stars appeared. Not the stars you see from atmosphere, not the clean bright points of planetside dark, but the absolute stars of deep space, present in every direction, hard and numerous and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in the 100 kilometers behind the ship. They were, Bran had always thought, a kind of honesty. They did not adjust their expression based on what occurred beneath them. They simply were, which was what had always been both the most comfortable and the most uncomfortable thing about space. He would debrief tomorrow. He would report 4 survivors. He would report the battery's structural integrity, the emergency power duration, the communications capability, the passive ranging data he had collected during the 7 hours. He would report the rotation correction and what had corrected it. He would report the engagement data that the battery systems had captured, which would be cross-referenced with every other surviving record of the Battle of Solace and assembled into the complete picture that Command would use to understand what had happened today, what had been lost, what could be recovered. He would not report the corner. And Sayo would sit in her debrief and answer the questions asked of her. She was a communications officer. There would be many questions about the Keth signal she had monitored, the targeting data she had provided, the frequency she had analyzed, and the intelligence she had extracted over 4 hours of engagement, and she would answer all of them fully and accurately and without evasion, because she was a professional and because the information mattered and because that was her job, and she was very good at her job. She would not mention the name. She would carry it in the part of her that was her mother's eyes and her father's cheekbones and the involuntary resonance that ran along them when her nervous system was under load, the part of her that heard things no equipment captured, that had been classified in her personnel file as an enhanced communication asset and had never been classified, in any file, as the thing it actually was, the place where 2 species overlapped, where the frequencies met, where something that was not quite either could listen to both. She would carry it there. The surgical suite hummed. Oren was alive, or would be. The surgeon had come out briefly to say stable, looking good, don't worry, with the particular casual confidence of someone who has seen a great deal worse and means it. Yael was sleeping in the medical bay, finally, her arm properly set, the concussion noted and monitored. Bran was sitting in the corridor. Sayo was sitting beside him. He looked at her once more, in profile, her dark eyes fixed on some middle distance that was not the bulkhead and not the stars, and he saw the stillness in her face and the steadiness of it, and he thought, she is holding something. He thought, she has always been holding something, and today she is holding more of it than before, and she will hold it for the rest of her life, and she is the right person to hold it, and I think she knows this, and I will not say any of this out loud. He looked at the stars visible through the observation port at the end of the corridor. Sayo looked at the middle distance. She held the name the way the debris field held the dead, carefully, without intending to release it, in the knowledge that keeping was the only thing left to offer and that offering it was not nothing. She had heard it in his signal before he'd spoken it. She had known, in the biological frequency that corresponded to youth and depletion and something that reached across 200 kilometers of catastrophe looking for anything that might understand, who was coming before he arrived. She had kept his name from before he gave it. She kept it still. She would keep it. The Ardent logged 4 survivors recovered from Battery 7, THNS Vantage, engagement at Solace. The battle assessment recorded 41 human ships destroyed, estimated Keth losses 14 to 17 vessels, casualties on both sides pending full accounting. The battery itself was listed as unrecoverable debris. The debris field was designated a restricted navigation zone pending clearance. The clearance would take years. The name was not in any of these documents. It was somewhere else.